The world, for Maya, was a canvas of shifting light and tangled shapes. She didn't just see a tree. She saw the frantic, jagged lines of its winter branches clawing at a gray sky, or the soft, overlapping brushstrokes of its summer leaves against a brilliant blue. Her dorm room was less a living space and more a chaotic studio, a landscape of half-finished paintings, canisters of film, and delicate wire sculptures that caught the afternoon sun in webs of intricate shadow. Her camera was an extension of her own eye, a tool for capturing the fleeting moments of beauty that most people walked past without a second glance. She could spend an hour lying in the grass, not thinking, just observing the way a single dandelion stood bravely against a perfectly manicured lawn. This was her language. This was how she understood the universe, and it was precisely why she was drowning. Advanced Calculus 3 was not a canvas. It was a prison. It was a sterile, white-walled room filled with the dull hum of a projector and the faint, antiseptic smell of old chalk dust. It was a place where beauty went to die, replaced by symbols that looked like a secret code from an alien civilization. The endless string of Greek letters, integration symbols, and numbers that floated on the chalkboard made no sense to her. They were just noise, a frantic scrawl that meant nothing, felt nothing, and offered no beauty. It was a mandatory course, a cruel hoop she had to jump through to get her fine arts degree, a final, painful nod to the well-rounded education the university promised in its glossy brochures. She tried, she really did. She would sit in the back of the massive lecture hall, her notebook open, her pen poised, ready to capture the magic. But Dr. Evans, the man at the front of the room, spoke in a language her mind refused to process. He was a legend, they said. A man who could see the elegant architecture of the universe in numbers, a modern-day Pythagoras. To Maya, he just looked severe. He was tall and impossibly thin, and he dressed in drab gray suits that seemed to absorb all the light in the room. He paced as he lectured, his dark-rimmed glasses perched on the end of his nose, his voice low, a monotonous drone that was somehow more hypnotizing than it was engaging. He would write an equation on the board, a long, sprawling monster of variables and functions, and then turn to the class. And as you can plainly see, he would say, gesturing to the chalkboard with a piece of chalk like a conductor's baton, the limit approaches infinity. And in the front rows, the engineering and physics students would nod, their faces lighting up with comprehension. They could see it. They could see the music. For them, it was plain. For Maya, it was like being told a joke in a language she didn't speak, and everyone in the room was laughing. She would look from their knowing faces back to the board, searching for any hint of the beauty they saw. All she saw was a chaotic mess of black scratches, like a flock of birds had collided with the wall. She felt a knot of frustration and shame tighten in her stomach. It wasn't that she wasn't smart. She knew she was. Her mind was a powerful tool, capable of seeing connections and patterns others missed. But in this room, her mind was a useless, blunt instrument. She spent her nights in the library, surrounded by textbooks that felt as heavy as tombstones. She would read the same paragraph over and over, the words blurring into a meaningless soup. The derivative of a function of a real variable measures the sensitivity to change of the function value. What did that even feel like? She tried to picture it. A slope? A curve? She could imagine a hillside, steep and then gentle. But the dy/dx on the page remained cold and lifeless. She tried watching online tutorials where cheerful instructors would draw animated graphs and use simple analogies. Think of it like a car's speedometer, one would say. For a moment it would click, a tiny flicker of understanding. But then she would return to Dr. Evans's lecture, where the speedometer was suddenly a complex, imaginary number, and the flicker would die. Swallowed by the darkness again, the other students didn't seem to help. They formed tight-knit study groups in the library, hunched over laptops, scribbling furiously, speaking in a shorthand of integrals and theorems. Maya had tried to join one once, hovering awkwardly at the edge of their table. "What's the trick for finding the antiderivative of this?" one student had asked, pointing to his book. Another had launched into a rapid-fire explanation using terms Maya had never heard. She just stood there, silent, feeling like an imposter. After a few minutes, without a word to her, they went back to their conversation, their little bubble of genius impenetrable. She retreated back to her solitary corner, feeling more alone than ever. The midterm exam loomed like a storm on the horizon. A day of reckoning she knew she was not prepared for. The anxiety was a physical thing, a low-grade fever that kept her up at night. She drank so much coffee, her hands trembled, and the scent of it became permanently attached to her notes. In the days leading up to the exam, she almost gave up. A voice in her head, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Dr. Evans's, kept whispering that it was pointless, that some people just weren't built for this, that she was an artist, and this was a world of scientists, and never the two shall meet. But another voice, a quieter, more stubborn one, fought back. It was the voice that made her get up at 5 a.m. to photograph the sunrise, the voice that told her to add one more layer of paint, to try a different angle, to not give up on a difficult piece. It was her own voice. So she pushed forward, fueled by a stubborn refusal to be defeated. She stayed up for 2 nights straight, her textbook a blur, her mind a battlefield of warring concepts. She didn't understand it, not really, but she was trying to memorize the steps, the patterns, the sheer mechanics of it all. She was trying to learn the dance without. Hearing the music, she walked into the exam hall the day of the test, feeling hollow and jittery. The room was buzzing with nervous energy, the sound of 100 students tapping their pens and rustling papers. When the exam was placed on her desk, she just stared at it. It was a sea of the same familiar, incomprehensible symbols. Her mind, which had been so full of formulae and steps just hours before, was now completely blank. It was like looking at a foreign alphabet. She picked up her pen, her hand shaking. She wrote her name. Then she just sat there, the minutes ticking by. The silence pressing in on her, she managed to solve a few of the simpler problems. The one she had memorized by rote, like a child reciting a poem without knowing the meaning of the words. But the longer, more complex questions were walls she could not climb. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, hot and sharp. She looked around the room and saw everyone else writing, their heads down, their pens moving with a purpose she desperately envied. She was an island of incompetence in an ocean of competence. When the time was up, she handed in her paper, her face burning with shame. It was nearly blank. Getting the test back a week later was a formality. She already knew the outcome. Dr. Evans walked into the lecture hall holding a thick stack of papers. He didn't even bother to lecture first. He just began walking down the aisles, dropping the graded exams onto the students' desks. The sound of the paper hitting the desktop was like a series of tiny, sharp gavel strikes. Thump, thump. When he got to her row, he paused for a fraction of a second before dropping hers onto her desk. He didn't look at her. She didn't want to turn it over. For a moment, she just stared at the blank back page. But then, with a sense of grim finality, she flipped it over. There it was, circled in a thick, unforgiving red ink. See? It wasn't just a grade. It was a verdict. It was the world telling her that she was right all along, that she didn't belong. The C felt heavier than any of her heavy art textbooks. It was a weight in her chest, a pressure that made it hard to breathe. She could feel the heat of tears pricking the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him, not in front of all these people who understood. She gathered her things slowly, her movements stiff and robotic, and walked out of the hall while Dr. Evans was still talking, her head held high. She didn't go back to her dorm. She just walked aimlessly through the sprawling campus, the bright, happy faces of other students a blur. She felt invisible. For the first time in her life, her unique way of seeing the world felt like a curse, a fundamental flaw in her design. She had tried to cross over into their world, and she had been utterly, publicly, and humiliatingly rejected. But as she stood by the lake, watching the ripples spread across the water, something else began to stir in her, a small, hot spark beneath the cold ash of her failure. It was defiance. It was anger. And it was the sudden, unwavering certainty that she would not let this be the end of the story. She would not let that man and his numbers have the last word, asterisk. The walk back to her dorm was a blur of muted colors and muffled sounds. The C wasn't just a grade. It was a brand, a public declaration of her inadequacy. The weight of it felt physical, pressing down on her shoulders as she climbed the stairs to her room. The moment she stepped inside, the familiar chaos of her art studio, the comforting smell of turpentine, the vibrant jars of paint, the half-finished canvases leaning against the wall, offered no solace. Instead, it felt like a collection of toys from a childhood she was now being forced to abandon. Her camera, once a trusted friend, sat on her desk like a sad, unused gadget, its lens covered in a fine layer of dust. This was her world, the world she understood and could control, but it wasn't enough. A single, sterile course taught by a man who didn't know her name was threatening to dismantle it all. The university's well-rounded education felt less like a gift and more like a punishment. For 2 days, she did nothing. She didn't eat, she didn't paint, she didn't even pick up a camera. She just lay on her bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying the scene in the exam hall over and over. She saw the confident faces of her classmates, the indifferent face of Dr. Evans, as he dropped the test on her desk. The shame was a cold, heavy blanket. She thought about just dropping the class, taking the failure, and finishing her degree with a different, hopefully easier science requirement. It would be so simple. She could retreat back into her world of light and color, a world where she was competent, where she was valued. But every time she considered it, a small, stubborn fire deep inside her would flicker. It was the same fire that made her spend hours perfecting a single brushstroke, the fire that refused to accept good enough. Dropping the class felt like surrender, and Maya was not a person who surrendered easily. She had been dismissed, underestimated, and she hated it. She hated the feeling of being looked at as if she were simple, as if her mind was a decorative but ultimately useless thing. On the third morning, she woke up not with despair, but with a sliver of resolve. She couldn't beat him at his own game. She knew that now. Trying to learn his language was like trying to teach a fish to climb a tree. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to. Maybe she could find a different way to communicate. She wouldn't drop the class, but she also wouldn't continue to fail in silence. She would have to go to him. She would have to face Dr. Evans. The idea filled her with a cold dread. His office was in the mathematics building, a part of campus she had always avoided. It was a sleek, modern structure of glass and steel that felt as cold and unwelcoming as she imagined its inhabitants to be. The air inside was different too. It didn't smell like old books and coffee. It smelled like computers and floor wax. The hallways were lined with portraits of stern-looking men from the 1950s, their eyes seeming to follow her with silent judgment. She found his name on a directory next to a polished wooden door, Dr. Alistair Evans. She stood outside for a long time, her heart hammering against her ribs, practicing what she would say. But the words felt clumsy and pathetic in her head. "I'm trying, but I don't understand. I'm not a math person. Is there anything else I can do?" They all sounded like excuses. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. A muffled, impatient voice from inside called, "Come in." No. She pushed the door open and stepped into a world that was the complete opposite of her own. His office was neat to the point of being sterile. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with volumes that had strange symbols on their spines. There was no art on the walls, no personal photos on the desk, no hint of a life lived outside of this room. The air was still and heavy with the scent of old paper. Dr. Evans sat behind a large oak desk, a mountain of papers stacked perfectly to his right. He didn't look up when she entered, his focus remaining on the article he was reading, a red pen in his hand. He was even more intimidating up close. He had sharp features, thin lips, and eyes that were a pale, piercing blue. He finally glanced up, his gaze landing on her with no hint of recognition. Double quotes. "Yes," he said, his voice as clipped and precise as his handwriting. "Dr. Evans? I'm Maya, from your advanced calculus class," she said, her voice coming out much smaller than she intended. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his expression unchanging. He clearly remembered her. She was the one who got the C. The one who was out of place. "I see. What can I do for you?" He set his red pen down, but his fingers kept tapping a rhythm on the desk, a nervous, impatient beat that made her feel even more like she was wasting his valuable time. She took a seat in the hard wooden chair in front of his desk, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wanted to talk to you about my grade. About my performance in class," she began. "I'm really struggling. I'm trying very hard, but I can't seem to connect with the material. I don't see it the way you do, the way the other students do." As she spoke, she saw a change in his eyes. It wasn't sympathy or understanding. It was amusement. The corner of his mouth twitched, and a faint, patronizing smile slowly spread across his face. It was the look of someone who had heard this exact plea 100 times before and found it utterly tedious. He listened, his chin resting on his steepled fingers, his gaze fixed on her as if she were a mildly interesting insect. When she finished, he let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a loud or cruel laugh, but it was worse than that. It was a laugh of dismissal, sound that cut right through her carefully constructed speech and laid her vulnerability bare. "Connect with the material," he repeated as if the words themselves were amusingly naive. "Ms. Jensen, calculus is not a piece of art to be connected with. It is a system. It is a language of logic and precision. One either understands its grammar, or one does not. You do not." The directness of his words hit her like a physical blow. She had expected some degree of condescension, but this was something else. It was a complete and total invalidation of her not just as a student, but as a thinker. "But I'm a visual person," she tried to explain, her voice trembling slightly. "I learn by seeing things, by building them, by translating poetry with a dictionary," he finished for her, the smile never leaving his face. "You are looking for beauty in a place where it does not exist. There is no why in the way you mean it. There is only what is. It is a fundamental difference in how our minds are constructed. It is not a moral failing, simply a fact." She felt a hot surge of anger begin to push back against the shame. He wasn't just telling her she was bad at calculus. He was telling her she was fundamentally lesser, that her entire way of seeing the world was a charming but useless distraction from the real work of logic. He had reduced her entire being, her passion, her art, to a fundamental difference. He leaned back in his leather chair, the soft creak of the leather the only sound in the room. He seemed to be enjoying this, enjoying the opportunity to lecture a lost soul. He turned and pulled a heavy, cloth-bound book from the shelf behind him. The cover was a dark, worn burgundy, and the gold lettering on the spine had faded almost completely away. He handled it with a certain reverence, his fingers tracing the embossing on the cover. "I have a theory about students like you," he began, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial tone. "You believe that with enough effort, with enough passion, you can overcome any obstacle. It is a very romantic notion, but it is not true." He flipped through the brittle yellowed pages of the book until he found what he was looking for. "This is a problem from a field of mathematics known as geometric calculus. It is, for all intents and purposes, an unsolved puzzle. I have been working on it, off and on, for years." He grabbed a pen and a notepad from his desk and, with a few swift, fluid strokes, copied a short, dense-looking equation. It was a string of symbols that made her stomach clench. Just by looking at it, he tore the sheet from the notepad and held it out to her. She didn't want to take it. She wanted to stand up and walk out of that room and never think about Dr. Evans or his cursed subject ever again. But his eyes were on her, challenging her, daring her. The part of her that refused to be made small, the part of her that was still angry, reached out and took the paper. "Solve this for me," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Solve this by the end of the semester. Not for a grade for the class. I will give you that. Pass. No, if you can solve this, I will give you an A. A final. Unequivocal A." Not only that, he leaned forward, his pale blue eyes boring into hers. "I will write you a letter of recommendation for any academic honor, any graduate program, any fellowship you desire. My word carries a certain weight, as you might imagine." She stared at the paper, at the cryptic collection of symbols. It felt like a taunt. "Of course," he said, leaning back in his chair again, his smile returning. "We both know that you won't. You can't. At that moment, she remembered the two other people in the room. They were seated in a small corner nook, a man and a woman. Both much younger than Dr. Evans. They were clearly graduate students, his assistants. And they had been pretending to be absorbed in their laptops this whole time. Now they looked up, and a shared silent snicker passed between them. It was a tiny sound, barely audible, but in the heavy silence of the office, it was like a gunshot. They saw her. They saw the whole pathetic exchange, and they were laughing at her. That was it. That was the moment something in Maya shifted. The anger, which had been a flickering flame, roared into a fire. The humiliation was still there, a hot, stinging shame, but now it had fuel. It had purpose. The patronizing smile on Dr. Evans's face, the smug snickers from his assistants, the absolute certainty in his voice that she was nothing. A nobody who couldn't possibly comprehend his world, it all coalesced into a single, powerful and defiant thought. You're wrong. Without another word, without even a glance back at his face, Maya stood up. She turned her back ramrod straight and walked out of the office. She didn't slam the door. She didn't say a word. She just left. She held the piece of paper in her hand, not as a defeat, but as a declaration. She clutched it so tightly that the edges began to crumple in her fist. He had given her an impossible challenge designed to mock her, but he had also, unknowingly, given her a weapon. He had given her a target for her frustration, a tangible enemy to fight. He had laughed at her, and he had handed her a puzzle. And in that moment, with the fire of his condescension burning in her chest, Maya knew, with absolute certainty, that she was going to make him regret it. She didn't know how. She didn't know where to start. But she was going to find a way. Asterisk, the piece of paper sat on her desk, a stark white rectangle in the chaos of her studio. It felt like an artifact from another world, a world of sterile offices and cold logic. The symbols on it, the unfamiliar Greek letters, and the aggressive, sharp-edged operators seemed to mock her. For the first week, she treated it like a homework assignment from hell. She tried to force it, to beat it into submission using the old methods. She checked out every book on calculus and geometry the library had, piling them around her bed like a fortress. She stayed up until 3 or 4 in the morning, her eyes burning, her head throbbing. Trying to force her brain to think like Dr. Evans's, she would copy the equation onto a fresh sheet of paper, staring at it, willing it to reveal its secrets. But it never did. The symbols just stared back, silent and impenetrable. Every failed attempt was another small victory for him. She could almost hear his laugh, see the smug look on his face. The anger that had propelled her out of his office began to curdle into a deep, frustrating despair. This was exactly what he wanted. For her to struggle, to fail, and to finally give up, proving him right. Her studio, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison cell where she was serving a sentence for her own inadequacy. The vibrant paints on her palette looked dull. The blank canvases seemed to taunt her. Her camera felt like a piece of alien technology she no longer knew how to use. How could she capture the beauty of the world when a simple equation could make her feel so powerless? One Tuesday evening, after yet another fruitless 8-hour session with her calculus textbooks, she hit a wall. She couldn't look at another number, another symbol. If she did, she felt like she might actually scream. In a fit of pure frustration, she swept the books and papers off her desk with a single, violent motion. They clattered to the floor, sending up a cloud of dust and loose pages. She didn't bother to pick them up. Instead, she did the only thing that still felt like her. She retreated to the one place where she felt in control, the dark room. The red glow of the safe light was a familiar comfort. A warm, soothing blanket in the pitch black. The smell of the chemicals, acrid and sharp, was the perfume of creation. This was her church. Here, in the quiet, she could bring an image to life, coaxing it from the blankness of a piece of photographic paper. She had a roll of film she'd developed a few days ago, pictures she'd taken on a walk through a local park trying to clear her head. She fished the strips of negatives out of the sleeve and held them up to the red light. They were mostly just snapshots, things that had caught her eye, the texture of bark on an old oak, the way sunlight filtered through a canopy of leaves, The perfect spiral of a snail shell on a damp stone, she decided to work on one image in particular. It was a picture of a spider's web, glistening with dew from an early morning fog. She had been fascinated by it at the time, spending nearly an hour crouched in the damp grass, capturing the intricate design. She placed the negative into the enlarger, framed the image, and focused until the delicate silken threads were sharp on the easel below. She slipped a piece of glossy paper into the holder, set the timer for a few seconds, and pressed the button. As the light projected the web's image onto the paper, she wasn't thinking about calculus or Dr. Evans. She was just thinking about the web. She dropped the paper into the developer solution, rocking the tray gently. She watched, mesmerized, as the image began to magically appear from the blank white. The thin, strong lines of the web emerged first, a perfect, complex, geometric shape. Then the dewdrops appeared, each one a tiny, brilliant jewel, catching the light from the enlarger, a miniature universe contained in a sphere of water. She was so lost in the process, so focused on the art, that she almost missed it. As the image fully developed, she found herself not just seeing the web, but seeing it. She saw the way the threads were stretched taut between anchor points, creating a series of triangles and polygons. She saw the way the tension was distributed across the structure, each strand sharing the load, every single thread essential to the integrity of the whole. She saw the curves where the dewdrops weighed down the silk, creating perfect tiny arcs, each arc a demonstration of stress and balance. It was a perfect, physical, tangible system of curves, tension, and rates of change. And then, like a flash of lightning in the dark room, a connection was made. A single, incandescent thought illuminated the fog of her frustration. This wasn't just a picture. It was a diagram. Her heart started to pound, not with anxiety, but with a sudden, electric excitement. She quickly finished the development process, rinsing and drying the print. She carried the photograph out of the darkroom and into her room, holding it up to the light from her desk lamp. Her eyes, which for weeks had been blinded by the abstract symbols on that cursed piece of paper, were now wide open. The dewdrop's curve, that was a derivative. The tension in the thread, that was a function of the distance between anchor points. The entire structure of the web was a complex, interdependent system, a living, breathing proof of the very principles Dr. Evans talked about in his cold, sterile classroom. He saw it in numbers. She was seeing it in nature. She wasn't a calculator. She was an observer. Her strength wasn't in crunching the numbers. It was in seeing the patterns they represented in the real world. This realization changed everything. She put the photograph down and walked over to her desk, pushing aside the heavy calculus textbooks. She looked at Dr. Evans's problem again, but this time she didn't see it as a string of impossible commands. She saw it as a description of a physical thing, a shape, a form. How could she build it? She abandoned the paper and the pen. Her tools were different. From a closet in the corner of her room, she pulled out a box of her modeling supplies, spools of thin but strong wire, blocks of modeling clay, a hot glue gun, and a pair of needle-nose pliers. She laid them all out on her desk, a chaotic array of artistic weapons. For the next several hours, she worked with a feverish intensity she hadn't felt in weeks. She wasn't solving a math problem. She was creating a sculpture. She bent the wire, using the pliers to create graceful curves and sharp angles. Her hands guided by the photograph of the spider's web and the new way of seeing it had given her. She wasn't thinking about fx or dy dx. She was thinking about tension and release, about balance and form. The wire represented the basic function, the skeleton of the problem. The clay she used to create anchor points, solid nodes, where the different parts of the function met. She used thread to represent the secondary interactions, the way the changing parts of the system influenced each other. It was messy and it was strange, but as she worked, she felt she was finally translating the problem from the language of Dr. Evans into her own native tongue. When she was done, she didn't have a set of numbers or a line-by-line proof. She had a small, intricate, three-dimensional model sitting on her desk. It was an odd-looking thing, a tangle of wire and thread and clay that would make no sense to a mathematician. But to her, it was a map. It was the problem made real. But she wasn't finished. She needed to show him the behavior of the system, not just its form. She picked up her camera again, the familiar weight of it in her hand feeling like coming home. She spent the next day photographing her little sculpture from every possible angle. She used a single harsh light source to cast long, dramatic shadows that emphasized the model's dimensionality. She took close-ups of the wire curves and the clay anchor points. She used a shallow depth of field to blur the background and make certain elements pop. Each photograph was an illustration. Each picture was a piece of evidence. They didn't show the solution as a number. They showed it as a story of shapes and light and shadow. She arranged her favorite prints on a large piece of black mat board, creating a visual narrative. The sequence began with a wide shot of the entire sculpture, then moved to closer shots, isolating the individual components and their relationships. It was a presentation, a thesis, a proof. It was an argument made not with symbols, but with beauty. She was no longer trying to speak his language. She was forcing him to speak hers. As she stood back and looked at her work, a smile touched her lips. It was a small, quiet smile, the kind of smile a person has when they know a secret no one else does. He had given her an impossible challenge, thinking it would break her. But he had underestimated her. He had given her a puzzle, and in her stubborn refusal to be beaten, she had turned it into a piece of art, and she had a feeling, deep in her bones, that he was about to be very surprised. The last day of the semester arrived with a biting wind that whipped through the campus, scattering the last of the autumn leaves. For most students, it was a day of relief, a final hurdle before the freedom of winter break. For Maya, it was the day of her trial. She walked across the quad, not with the heavy dread she had carried for months, but with a strange humming energy, a current of nervous power thrumming just beneath her skin. She wasn't carrying a notebook filled with frantic calculations or a heavy textbook. She carried a large, flat portfolio case under one arm and held her sculptural model, the small, intricate wire-clad creation, in her other hand. It felt less like an academic submission and more like carrying a piece of her own soul into battle. The mathematics building was as cold and imposing as ever. But today, she barely noticed it. Her focus was a single point of light at the end of a long, dark tunnel, Dr. Evans's office door. She didn't hesitate. She knocked the same sharp, decisive rap she had used weeks ago. The same muffled voice called out, "Come in." She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene was almost exactly as she remembered it. Dr. Evans was behind his desk, scribbling furiously in a red pen. And in the corner nook, the two graduate assistants were there, hunched over their laptops. They looked up as she entered, and a flicker of recognition crossed their faces, quickly followed by the same familiar, condescending smirk. They were expecting to see a defeated student come to beg for mercy, or at best, to submit a pitiful, half-finished attempt at the problem. Maya could practically hear their thoughts. "Look, the art girl is back. Let's see what kind of pretty pictures she drew." Dr. Evans looked up, his expression one of weary expectation. "Ms. Jensen," he said, his tone flat, "I assume you're here to concede." "As I expected." Maya said nothing. She just walked calmly to his desk and placed the portfolio case and the small sculpture down. The soft thud of the case on the polished wood was the only sound in the room. The graduate assistants watched her with barely disguised amusement, their eyes flicking between her and Dr. Evans, waiting for the show to begin. "I didn't concede," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "and I didn't solve it on paper." Dr. Evans leaned back in his chair, a sigh escaping his lips. He looked from her to the odd little sculpture and the flat case, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his features. He had expected a tearful plea or a stack of failed equations. This was something else. This was ... strange. "Then what is this?" he asked, a note of impatience returning to his voice. "Some kind of artistic interpretation?" "I told you this isn't about interpretation. It's about a solution." "It is a solution," Maya said. "Just not the one you were looking for." She opened the portfolio case. Instead of a report or a set of calculations, she revealed a series of her black and white photographs, beautifully matted and arranged in a sequence that told a story. They were stark and dramatic, each one a masterpiece of composition and light. The two assistants in the corner, who had been about to go back to their work, found their eyes drawn to the images. They leaned forward, their smirks softening into expressions of curiosity. Maya pointed to the first photograph, a wide shot of her entire sculpture. "This," she began, "is the function itself. The structure of it. The wire represents the primary variables, the way they interact. Each joint of clay is a point of convergence, where the rates of change are most volatile." Not in the hesitant, apologetic tone she had used before, but with the clear, confident passion of an artist explaining her vision. She didn't use any mathematical terms. She used her own words. "I couldn't understand the numbers," she admitted, "so I tried to build the problem, to see what it looked like in real life." She moved to the next photograph, a close-up of one of the wire curves. "This part of the function here," she said, tracing the curve with her finger in the air. "It's not just a line on a graph. It's a bend. It's a point of stress, like a tree branch bending under the weight of snow. The way it bends, the speed at which it bends, that's the derivative. It's not a number. It's an action." Dr. Evans was silent. He was watching her, but his eyes kept darting back to the photographs. The condescension was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, furrowed concentration. The graduate assistants were no longer smirking. They were whispering to each other, pointing at the photographs, their expressions shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension. One of them, a young man with glasses, leaned forward so far he almost fell out of his chair. "Wait," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She's showing the second derivative as the change in shadow. The way the shadow deepens as the curve gets steeper. Dot." His voice trailed off as he stared at the picture, his mind clearly reworking the problem in a way he had never considered. Maya continued, her confidence growing as she saw she was getting through. "And this," she said, pointing to a photo where a single thread was stretched between two pieces of clay. "This is the relationship between the two subfunctions. It's not an abstract concept. It's a connection. It's a literal line of tension. If one anchor point moves, it affects the entire structure. You can see it. You don't have to calculate it." She picked up the actual sculpture and gently pressed one of the clay nodes. The wire and thread shifted and resettled in a new, elegant form. "See?" she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's alive." The room was dead silent. The condescension had evaporated, replaced by a kind of breathless, shared awe. The young man with the glasses was now standing, his hands resting on the back of his chair, his eyes wide. Dr. Evans had completely abandoned his desk. He stood up and walked around to the front, standing beside Maya. He didn't look at her. His entire focus was on her work. He picked up one of the photographs, holding it up to the light. He ran his thumb over the image, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He looked from the photo to the physical model, then back again. The young man in the corner spoke up again, his voice full of a new kind of respect. "That's why the integral was always so messy. The classic approach tries to flatten it. She's preserving the three-dimensional tension. The whole thing is a proof of concept." Finally, Dr. Evans looked at Maya. The piercing intellectual arrogance in his eyes was gone. In its place was a look of profound, almost bewildered, wonder. He looked at her not as a failed student, but as a peer. As someone who had seen something he had missed. "God," he breathed, the words soft and heavy in the quiet room. He set the photograph down and reached out, his fingers gently touching the wire sculpture as if it were a priceless artifact. "You didn't just solve it. You translated it." He looked from the model back to her face, his blue eyes filled with an emotion she never thought she would see from him. "You saw it," he said, his voice full of a newfound reverence. "You saw the shape of it." The two assistants were now standing completely, their laptops forgotten, their faces illuminated by a shared moment of discovery. They were looking at her not with pity or mockery, but with a kind of stunned admiration. She had not only answered the challenge, she had completely upended their understanding of what an answer could be. Dr. Evans sank back into his chair. But he didn't lean back in a relaxed pose. He leaned forward, his elbows on his desk, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. He looked from the art on his desk to the artist who had created it, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the person who saw the world differently, not as a flaw, but as a gift. He saw the strength in her unique perspective, a strength that had managed to solve a problem he thought only a mind like his could conquer. The C on her midterm, the lecture hall full of numbers, the frustration, the shamet, all faded away. In this quiet office, surrounded by dusty books, a young artist had not just passed a class. She had changed the rules of the game, and the man who had laughed at her was now the one who was shocked into silence. The silence in Dr. Evans's office was a living thing. It was thick and heavy, filled with the unsaid, with the echo of what had just happened. The two graduate assistants stood frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning admiration. They looked from the small, intricate sculpture on the desk to Maya, their expressions slowly shifting from the familiar condescension to a new and unfamiliar respect. They were seeing her not as the art student who was out of her depth, but as a colleague who had just sailed in from an undiscovered country with a map of a new world. Dr. Evans was the most still of all. He remained leaning forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on the wire and clay model as if trying to absorb the very essence of it. The cold, sterile room, which had always felt like a fortress of his intellect, now seemed like a cage. He had spent his career mastering the language of symbols, the abstract and elegant dance of numbers. He had built a reputation on seeing patterns that others couldn't. And this young woman, this student he had dismissed with a laugh and a patronizing challenge, had just shown him that he was, in some fundamental way, blind. She hadn't needed his language. She had built her own. He finally looked up at Maya, his pale blue eyes stripped of their usual arrogance. There was no condescension in them now, only a deep, profound sense of wonder. "My God," he whispered again, the words carrying the weight of a paradigm shifting on its axis. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of disbelief that seemed completely out of character for the precise and composed professor. Then, he did something that shocked everyone in the room, perhaps most of all himself. He began to laugh. It wasn't the short, sharp, dismissive laugh Maya had heard before. It was a deep, genuine, incredulous laugh that started in his chest and bubbled up, full of amazement and self-deprecation. The graduate assistants looked at each other, wide-eyed, not knowing how to react. Maya just stood there, a small, cautious smile playing on her lips. "I spent 20 years on that problem," Dr. Evans said, his laughter subsiding into a shake of his head. 20 years. I filled notebooks. I wrote proofs that spanned 100 pages. They were correct, they were ... valid. But they were ugly. They were convoluted, messy, and utterly without grace. They were a testament to brute force, not elegance. He gestured to her work, to the photos and the sculpture. "And you. You waltzed in here and made it beautiful. You made it simple." He stood up and began to pace the small office, a new energy animating his movements. It was no longer the impatient, nervous tapping. It was the kinetic energy of discovery. "This isn't just a solution," he said, his voice gaining its academic authority again, but this time it was charged with excitement. "This is a new methodology. You've translated a purely abstract, multidimensional concept into a tactile, visual, and intuitive form. This is revolutionary." He stopped pacing and looked at his assistants. "Martin Anja, do you see what this means? The implications for nonlinear dynamics, for teaching complex systems, for everything." The two assistants nodded, their faces alight with intellectual fervor. They were no longer just students. They were witnesses to the birth of a new idea. Dr. Evans turned back to Maya, his expression now one of complete sincerity. "Ms. Jensen, I owe you an apology. A profound and deeply felt apology. My arrogance was a blindness. I assumed that because you did not speak my language, you had nothing to say. I could not have been more wrong." He took a breath. You have not only fulfilled the terms of our challenge, you have far exceeded them. You have an A, of course. You have an A more than that. I will write you a letter of recommendation that will open any door you wish to walk through. But that is not enough." He paused, his mind clearly racing, connecting dots, planning his next move. "Your work needs to be seen. Not by me, not by this department, by everyone." Picked up the phone on his desk, his fingers moving with a new urgency. "I'm canceling my regular lecture for Friday," he said, his voice firm. "We are going to have a special presentation. To the entire department, you will present this. You will show them what you have shown me." Maya felt a surge of panic mixed with a thrilling sense of validation. Present to the entire math department. To a room full of Dr. Evanses? "I don't know if I can explain it the right way," she stammered. "I'm not a mathematician." Dr. Evans looked at her and a small, knowing smile touched his lips. "That is precisely why you are the only one who can. I will be there to translate if you need me. But this is your language, your discovery. You will be the one to teach them how to see it." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Evans, it turned out, was a man possessed. He was no longer the stern, unapproachable professor. He was an enthusiastic collaborator. He and Maya spent hours in her studio, which was no longer a place of shame, but a think tank of unconventional ideas. He would bring in complex equations and ask her what she saw. In turn, she would show him new models or photos, and he would help her translate her visual concepts back into the formal language of mathematics, giving her the words to articulate her vision. The two graduate assistants were often there too, their initial curiosity blossoming into genuine excitement as they helped prepare the presentation materials. They were no longer a stern professor and a struggling student. They were a team. The day of the presentation arrived. The large lecture hall where Maya had once felt so alone and incompetent was now packed. It wasn't just students. It was professors from the mathematics, physics, and even engineering departments. People who had heard the rumors and came to see what all the fuss was about. Maya stood at the front next to Dr. Evans, her heart beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He started the presentation. "Many of you know me as a man of numbers, of proofs, and of logic," he began, his voice calm and steady. "But today, I am here to tell you that I have been blind. Today, we are going to learn a new way to see." He then introduced Maya and stepped back, giving her the floor. A hush fell over the room. Maya took a deep breath and began, just as she had in his office. She didn't start with equations or theorems. She started with a photograph of a spider's web. She spoke of tension, balance, and shape. She told them her story of frustration and discovery. The room was silent, every eye on her. As she showed her photographs and explained her model, she could see the same shift happening on their faces that she had seen on Dr. Evans's. The skepticism melted away, replaced by the same dawning comprehension. An old gray-haired professor in the front row, known for his own formidable reputation, slowly nodded, a look of sheer amazement on his face. When she was finished, the room was quiet for a moment before it erupted in a wave of applause. It wasn't the polite, perfunctory clapping of a mandatory lecture. It was loud, enthusiastic, and genuine. Maya saw the graduate assistants beaming and clapping the loudest. And she saw Dr. Evans, standing beside the podium, his face lit with a sense of pride, a wonder she never would have thought possible. The final image wasn't one of a final grade or a conquered class. The story of her success traveled far beyond the university. A paper on visual spatial proof methodologies was published. With both of their names on it, a collaboration between a world-renowned mathematician and a young artist who had seen the world differently. The true shock to everyone wasn't just that she had solved the puzzle. It was that her solution, born from an artistic soul, was being adopted in fields she had never even considered. Physics departments were using her models to help visualize complex particle interactions. Engineering students were using her techniques to conceptualize structural stress tests. And Dr. Evans, the man who laughed, had become her biggest advocate. He was no longer just a lecturer. He was a student again, learning from the person he had so thoroughly underestimated. The final image was of him not in his sterile office, but standing before a lecture hall filled with his peers, enthusiastically explaining a complex mathematical concept, using a beautiful, worn-clad sculpture, his hands moving with an artist's passion. He wasn't just teaching math anymore. He was teaching people how to see, and it was all because a young woman armed with a camera and a stubborn refusal to be defeated had shown him how.